Gats and gittens, geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comic fans of all stripes, all nations, all nationalities, races and creeds, welcome. Welcome to Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, a comic book professional and long-standing, questions about what I do for a living. And as this thing has kind of evolved, just questions in general, my opinion on pop culture at large. So you ask the questions, I answer them. Let's get started. John Bua. I feel that the retirement of Denny O'Neil marks the end of an era. To me, he was the last great editor in comics. He said he was not just the editor of Batman, but also the custodian of Batman. He took his charge seriously and demanded his writers also take their positions seriously. Do you feel that the current crop of comic editors are non-entities, meaning that the writers can just crap out whatever comes to their minds without challenge or even examination? Yeah, Denny was the last of his breed. There were a very few serious lifer professional comic book editors after Denny, but Denny does mark the last of the old guard leaving, and there was a marked change at DC with his departure. Marvel was already coming apart at the seams when Denny left. But Marvel for the most part was rescued by some excellent creators who came in and worked their magic. I don't think the editors at Marvel had a whole lot to do with it. I think typically at Marvel you hired somebody hot and fabulous and talented, and they sort of drove the bus, and the editors stood by and let them do it. Which is why if you look at the history of Marvel, it's sort of a rise and fall of what talent they had. Whereas at DC, it's more, there's a hand at the wheel guiding things. More substance than Flash. And there's nothing wrong with a lot of Flash. Marvel is all about a lot of Flash. And DC's always been about substance. But once someone like Denny was gone, there was no hand at the wheel. DC was rudderless, to continue to torture my nautical analogy. Adrift on rough seas, and sometimes becalmed in the horse latitudes of their days. The editors who would replace Denny and Archie Goodwin and eventually Mike Carlin were largely indifferent to the quality of work they were producing. And so you end up with a non-serious crowd of editors who are not, particularly interested in the comic book medium. Comics are a stepping stone. They're a resume enhancer for their next job, working for one of the TV networks or a cable channel or, hip magazine, or maybe their own podcast. But, they're not in comics for life. They're not interested in the medium as a career, as an end stop. And, as I said before, at Marvel in particular, sometimes the creators ran the show. I mean, when you had guys like Mark Millar show up, to reboot your universe, I mean, Mark Millar was kind of in charge. The hot new talent artists they were kind of in charge. They were running the show. They were determining the direction of the books, and the editors were standing by and letting them happen. The proof of this is that a lot of those same editors are at Marvel today, and not producing anything of particular note, just sort of standing by and letting it happen. And of course, you've got a whole new brand of freelancer, the woke freelancer, who will cancel you if you disagree with them. So I imagine a lot of these editors live in fear of their own creative teams. And we've seen this. I've seen videos where basically you have writers threatening anybody who disagrees with them. Editors, fans, fellow creators, other writers, they just threaten everybody that they'll ruin them if they ever try to stand in their way. Well, it's not exactly a room full of tough guys when you gather a bunch of Marvel and DC editors together. So I imagine they pretty much live in fear for their jobs. And a lot of comic book editors we have left, I mean, this is the end of the road for some of these editors. They don't have any other skills. All they know how to do is edit comics, which is a weird thing to lay claim to. I can correct other people's comic book work. That's my special ability. So where are they going to work if they get canned from one of the big two? So they kind of have to go along with whatever wacky, trendy, crazy political agenda or whatever that their talents come up with, or they'll be accused of being some sort of phobic or some sort of ist. Fill in the blanks. But generally, it's non-serious people are editing your comic books now, for the most part. From Kian Kurji, I probably murdered your name, and I'm sorry. Greetings, Chuck Dixon from Nairobi, Kenya. Your video about John Carter has inspired me to go back and read a lot of pulp classics. When it comes to pulp, the big names that get thrown around are E.R. Burroughs, R.E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, C.A. Smith. What other pulp writers would you recommend whom you think are underrated? Well, I don't know if they're underrated. Maybe some are forgotten, but mainly Wade Wellman comes to mind. Wellman was a Southern gentleman who said a lot of horror stories in the South. He also wrote space opera and stuff like that. But he was somewhat of a poet for a pulp writer. And he wrote a lot of horror based on Southern folklore. Some of the folklore, I imagine, he just made up out of whole cloth, but some actually came from, Cajun tradition and things like that. These horror stories, and he had a real way with words, and he had a real way with dialect. I mean, a lot of times when you write dialect, it's annoying. But Wellman was a man of Dixie, and he knew how those people talked, and he knew how to make it compelling and believable and portrayed it honestly. And his stories are always well written, always interesting. Even when he's assigned to things like space opera, it's fun stuff. It's fun to read, and he was the one that came to mind. Another pair, Henry Kuttner and C.L. Katz Moore, they were a married couple, and they worked together quite often. They were part of the H.P. Lovecraft circle, the Cthulhu circle, and but they worked in like every genre imaginable. Space opera, hard science fiction, horror, and they wrote together and separately, and just extremely talented. Probably not as well remembered today as they were in the past. Now certainly not underrated, and I'm kind of going through my favorite writers of the pulps. And by pulps, I mean people whose career were largely in the pulps. In the 1950s with the paperback originals, we see some young guys in the pulps graduate to the paperbacks, and most of their career is in the paperback originals. I mean, people like Arthur C. Clarke and Frederick Paul, come to mind. But I'm talking about people whose majority of their career was in the pulps. So, you can't forget in the crime area, Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, who started out as pulp writers, and, they eventually move into, Hollywood and hardback editions of their books. They become best-selling authors, but their roots were in the pulp, detective magazines. And they sort of rose up out of them, based on the merit of their own work. Hammett and Chandler their stories are true American literature, although I don't think they were ever meant to be. I think they were just meant to be entertaining thrillers, which they are that too. Another two guys came out of the pulps. Cornell Woolrich, most famously wrote the story that the movie Rear Window was based on. Woolrich was a master plotter, eventually moved into paperback originals. wrote under his own name and the name William Irish, wrote a lot of stuff that ended up being adapted for movies. Really inventive. I think I mentioned he's just a master at coming up with fresh plot lines and fresh ideas. And the guy raised the bar often on himself, challenging himself to write, sort of boxing himself into very difficult situations, but always rising above them. Most memorable I can remember is he wrote a chapter of a book written from the perspective of a blind man. Try that sometime. First person account of a blind person. It's and he succeeded. Not only is it beautifully written and absolutely clear in its storytelling, but it's also highly suspenseful, very creepy, which he was good at. The other is Jim Thompson. Jim Thompson led a hell of a life, oil rigger, loan enforcer. I mean, he held all kinds of jobs, working at bars. And so he wrote about the seamy side of life. Again, another guy who Hollywood tapped a number of times, adapting his stories to the silver screen. But Thompson started out in the pulps, just hacking out stories for the pulps, and eventually moved into paperback originals in the 50s. But, those are names that come to mind. Of course, there's tons of others, Maxwell Grant, Kenneth Robeson, guys who, made their bones in the pulps, writing under incredibly unforgiving deadlines, but still managing to turn out, entertaining, witty, interesting, and suspenseful stuff. Gentle Savage. What do you think of Martin Scorsese as a director? Are you a fan of his movies at all, or do you think he's overrated? I don't think he's overrated by any means. Scorsese's like the real deal. He's a real movie fan. He started out, he probably wanted to just be a movie critic, or he ended up being a movie director. And I like Scorsese because he kind of makes the movies that he wants to see, and he works in a lot of different genres, and I've never seen him fail in any of them. And of course, he stays in his lane. He's never done a war movie. He's never done a Western. He enjoys those kind of movies, but I think he knows that, that's not his thing. That's not an area he would succeed in. But I've been aware of Scorsese from early days. I remember going to see Mean Streets on a double bill with the movie Badlands. Boy, talk about a lousy pair of movies for a date night. But Mean Streets sort of made me sit up and take notice of this guy, because, it's about a pair of brothers, sort of underworld figures, sort of fringe characters, not made men. And it just felt so real. A lot of this is due to the fact that Harvey Keitel and De Niro were doing a lot of improv. So everything on the screen seemed fresh, but it's a sometimes painful movie to watch because it's so brutally honest about the relationship of these characters and the people around them. And of course, he moves on to Taxi Driver, I guess was his first big hit. And I saw this at just the right age. I had a lousy job working in the city, didn't seem to have any prospects. And Travis Bickle spoke to me, not to the degree where I wanted to assassinate a political figure, but, I sure, felt his pain. Scorsese, another favorite of mine, again, I'm going to list favorites. His remake of Cape Fear, the J. Lee Thompson, Gregory Peck, Robert Mitchum vehicle from the early 60s. Remakes usually suck. But Scorsese obviously loved this movie so much, and he wanted to redo it and build on it. And his love of the original shows through because he uses some of the cast members from the original, as well as using Bernard Herrmann's original score, because why would you want to use any other score? Herrmann's score for the original Cape Fear is incredible. And so Scorsese just uses it in the same way in all the same places. And he makes a story, he updates the story. I mean, in the early 60s, and even today, Mitchum's portrayal of Max Cady is unsettling. But Scorsese and De Niro kind of grind it up to 11, where Cady is practically demonic. But it's a favorite of mine. Age of Innocence, I mean, here's a guy made, gangster films and crime films and thrillers, things like that, sort of artsy, elevated thrillers. And here he delves into an adaptation of a novel from the 1800s and masters it. It's a jaw-droppingly beautiful movie. And it's he made so much effort. I think he watched a lot of European period films to inform him about this. I mean, he watches a lot of movies. I think Scorsese watches 2 movies every day. It's like breakfast. And he takes his cue from European period films, and because of that, he's able to really delve into period. I mean, you are just lost in this. Everything about it, clothing, mannerisms, language, everything is absolutely perfect to take you back to New York City in its Gilded Age. And I also like the fact that he doesn't update it for quote unquote modern audiences. He keeps the sort of uptight sexual repression of the novel in place. There's no payoff for these characters. And it's all very mannered, but it's suspenseful and tragic and all of that. And I think more so for not going all the way, both literally and figuratively. Raging Bull, I think, is considered Scorsese's masterpiece. It certainly is an amazing film. Everything about it. I love that Scorsese he knows he'll take chances, but he knows never to go too far. Never. I said his stuff was artsy, but it's really not. It's just well crafted. He never goes for the artsy. He never goes to where you go. You leave the film and go, ooh, wasn't that clever? He's very much an invisible hand for an auteur director, and he certainly is an auteur director. I remember it wasn't until the second viewing of Raging Bull that I realized that in one of the fight scenes, the most furious fight scene that Jake LaMotta is in, he goes to slow motion. He sort of over revs the camera, goes to slow motion, and in amongst the crowd noises and the bell ringing and all the other ambient noises that would occur in a boxing ring during a major fight, he mixes in the shrieks and screams of wild animals. I mean, you can hear, howler monkeys, and I don't know what specifically what animals, but I swear I heard an elephant at one point, and he sort of mixes that in, just sort of like down in one of the lower tracks, and boy, is that effective. It's so effective to bring across like the bestial brutality that the ring is a jungle. But again, it's not brought to the forefront. It's sort of like you're intuiting it. It's there as a subliminal suggestion. And that's amazing filmmaking, to know how far to take something so that the audience is reacting to it without noticing it. And, I think I'm answering your question. Yeah, I don't think Guy's overrated. I think Guy's amazing. My favorite film of all, and a lot of people's favorite Scorsese film is Goodfellas. It's the best gangster movie ever made. It's based on real life, and it just feels real all throughout. And again, we go back to that Mean Streets feel, because a lot of this was improv, particularly scenes where Joe Pesci and De Niro are involved. They're following the script, but they're kind of making up the way they're going to get there. In the most obvious example, if you've seen the movie, is when Scorsese, De Niro, and Ray Liotta go to visit Joe Pesci's mom. Pesci, De Niro, and Liotta go to visit Pesci's mom, played by Martin Scorsese's mother. And everybody's talking except Liotta, because Scorsese's mom and and Joe Pesci and Robert De Niro are improvising, and they're off on their own thing. And Liotta is sitting there, unwilling, or whatever, to keep up. He's not in the scene. He's not entering the conversation with the others. And it's kind of funny because it works for the film too, that he's not as close to these two as they are to each other. And he's sort of aware that he's a guest in a home. So he's not, and the mom is there. So he's not as willingly entering the conversation to be as crude or suggestive as his friends are in front of this older woman. But in real life, it's Liotta just not knowing where to jump in. An excellent actor, but these three knew each other. These three knew each other so well that he felt like an outsider in this scene. And Scorsese's mom even says to him, "But what about you? You don't talk very much." And Ray Liotta breaks character. He's not even acting at this point. And he goes, I was just listening. What a wonderful scene, and a great scene to keep in the film. But I think one of the best, gangster films ever made, because it has all the tropes of a gangster movie that we want to see, but it sort of stands all of them on their head, and sort of meets your expectations and exceeds them for a great gangster film. Plus all the performances and the takeaway lines and the incredible scene after another. Now, I really like Casino, but it kind of gets lost in the pack because it followed Goodfellas, and it's not as good as Goodfellas. If Goodfellas had never been made, this probably would have been Scorsese's best gangster film. But it suffers from following Goodfellas, which is a shame because it's a good one, and it is a disturbing film as far as the depiction of corruption and betrayal and all the rest of it. And once again, De Niro is just creepy as all get out. Okay. And then Scorsese moves into the DiCaprio segment of his career where basically he can't get a movie greenlit unless Leo wants to do it. So he has to make a lot of movies that I don't think he normally would have made. I can't imagine he would have made The Aviator or The Departed. The Departed is a terrible movie. I don't care what anybody says. The Departed is a terrible movie, huge disappointment. And I think that Scorsese only did it basically to convince Leo to be in his next movie, which whatever that was. Not that there's anything wrong with DiCaprio, but I don't. He's no De Niro. He's not a replacement. But this is the way Scorsese got his films greenlit. I met a Hollywood agent once who basically summed up Hollywood as saying that even Scorsese doesn't make Scorsese movies anymore. But that said, Wolf of Wall Street is very much a Scorsese flick. It's like Goodfellas in a lot of ways. It's brash, and the way it's cut, the introduction of humor, dark humor and straight up humor, and the depiction of corruption and the rest of it. Of all of the DiCaprio Scorsese collaborations, it's the most Scorsese to my mind. Highly entertaining movie, and again based on a true story, which helps a lot. The other thing about Scorsese that I really admire is he is a true movie fan, and he has done more, I think, than any other single person to popularize the idea of restoring and maintaining our film libraries, our film histories. He's a tireless warrior for ringing the warning bell about us losing film. We're losing movies. They're rotting in the cans. The other thing on a personal note that I really appreciate and I'm grateful for is his valiant defense of letterboxing movies. And he was for letterboxing movies for video long before we had widescreen televisions. And he did a number of video essays on the importance of seeing the whole damn screen, seeing what it is the director wanted us to see. And this was like hand in hand with his efforts to promote film restoration. And, he not only goes around championing film restoration, he works to restore films himself. as well as getting other people to, open their wallets to, fund the restoration of a lot of our classic films. Otherwise, they would be lost to time or diminished by being seen in inferior prints or poor audio or whatever. And another testament to what a film fan he was that when he basically was able to make his own deals and put together his own crews, he chose as an editor a woman who edited movies for the CBS affiliate in New York City, because he would watch late night movies and wonder who's editing this, because they're bringing in the commercial at a natural break. I mean, somebody's editing these movies in a way that the commercial breaks don't hurt as much. They're not cutting in the middle of a scene. And he found, oh boy, I can't remember her name. I want to say Terry Arbogast. Is that right? You'll all correct me, I know. So he finds her and puts her to work doing actual feature films, because, he knew she understood. She got it. And, their collaborations have spoken for themselves. Hey! It's a gentle savage twin spin. Have you seen the BBC Sherlock Holmes Benedict Cumberbatch series? If so, are you a fan at all? I was at the beginning. I thought it was clever how they were updating it and the little asides and little Easter eggs. But, I realized I was being, I was being fooled by the writing, because the writer was doing what Alan Moore does. He was, basically congratulating the viewers on their own intelligence. Because I'm sitting there going, ooh, that references to this story, and this references to that story, and oh, that's a clever little turn. And it's like, okay, I'm being seduced here, in a nerdy way. And so, yeah, the first 2 seasons I enjoyed, and then I understand that this guy did a lot of Doctor Who stuff, and was at the heart of a lot of what's wrong with Doctor Who now. So, especially the final season of this gets kind of mopey and introspective, and a lot of things that Sherlock Holmes wasn't and shouldn't be. And so I kind of lost, I think I lost interest partway through the 3rd season and didn't finish it. Cumberbatch was perfectly cast. And, like I said, I enjoyed a lot of the music was great. And, but it was a little too self-referential, a little too clever by half. And, just sort of like so many stories now, concentrated more on character development than plot, and ended up chasing its own tail by the conclusion. Yvonne Magila, I know you've made a lot of adaptations from books to comics. When I was a kid, I remember reading the Arachnophobia comics based on the movie. So have you ever made an adaptation from a movie to comics? Is there any movie that you would like to? I did a comic book adaptation for Vertigo of the movie California, which was a psycho thriller with Brad Pitt and David Duchovny. And it was, I don't know what the comic was for. It was never meant for distribution. And it was, I think maybe it was to be included with the DVD or something. I don't know what it was. But I liked the screenplay, and eventually I saw the movie. I liked that as well. But the comic was never published. I mean, I saw all the artwork, but the comic was simply never published. And I tried to look up on Google anything about the comic on the internet, and once again proved that the internet is not the sum total of human knowledge, because there was nothing about the DC comic there. You'd be amazed at how much unpublished work is at both DC and Marvel. They could fill omnibuses, a shelf full of omnibuses, with work that was paid for and produced, but will never see the light of day. And this is one of them. Would I want to keep on doing I did a book called Blood, a werewolf thing. The movie was never produced. I've done quite a bit of that, actually, taking screenplays and adapting them into graphic novels. And the graphic novels are to be used as part of the pitch process. And boy, I've maybe done 10 of them, and none of them been produced. There's also the Wild Wild West adaptation by myself and Scott Beatty, which with art by Butch Guice, and it was called off halfway through because Will Smith didn't like his likeness, even though Butch dead on likeness of Will Smith. But he did. I think he just didn't like the idea of appearing in a comic book for some reason. And so it was canceled. A shame. The artwork was really good, even though that movie's awful. God, what an awful movie. And the thing about that movie was they kept sending us new versions. We're adapting a comic and we're getting rewrites. And I'm like, my God, what's going on the set? I must have read 26 very different versions of that screenplay before they pulled the plug on us. But someone asked me once, well, there must have been a story there somewhere. And I said, no, there was never a story. that movie was terrible from day one. Matt Oler, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Because of your YouTube series, I've checked out some of your cross-gen titles, including El Cazador. I love pirate stories. Do you remember what else you plan to do with that series? Yeah, I do. If you don't know, El Cazador was 6 issues published by CrossGen. It was written by me, drawn by Steve Epting, and it was a straight-up pirate adventure. There were no witches or werewolves or zombies or magic or anything in it. It's a straight-up period adventure set on Earth, and we researched the living hell out of this thing. We had books on knots that had pictures of knots because nautical, we wanted to appeal to nautical fiction readers, and you can't get anything wrong with them or you're going to hear about it. So I had to do a lot of reading on sailing ships and terms, and read a lot of in-period books to try to keep the language honest. And but it was fun. We had a lot of fun on that book. Hard work, but fun. Now, yeah, I knew where I was going at the end of issue 6. Not to spoil it for you, my lead character, Lady Sin, says to the other lead pirate character, whose name escapes me, "How well do you speak Latin?" And that would lead into the next arc. And I wrote issue 7. More on issue 7 later. So I wrote a 7th issue. And what it was the Lady Sin, my lady pirate, she was after the Jesuits. She wanted revenge on the Jesuits. And at the time, the Jesuits, and maybe even today, were sort of the enforcement arm of the Vatican. And so I had the Jesuits sailing the Spanish Main and bringing the Inquisition to the Caribbean. And they had an island fortress in which they kept hidden a treasure, a great treasure that they didn't want the world to see. And so Lady Sin assumes it's a treasure in gold, taken from Mexico, taken from the Aztecs and the Incas, and all stored on this island. And if she can get there, and in issue 7 she gets there, disguised as a nun, and she's going to find out what this is. And ultimately, what we find out is that the treasure is not gold, it's not silver, it's not emeralds or diamonds. It's a book of the Bible that's never been published. It's never, hasn't been read in thousands and thousands of years. And the Jesuits are guarding it because they feel that the information contained in this new book of the Bible is too dangerous to allow mankind to know about. And so, that's where I was ultimately going with the series, kind of a different direction for a pirate thing. But again, I wasn't trying to make any statement about religion or anything else. I just thought a lost book of the Bible would be a really cool MacGuffin to throw in to this period. And but it was still going to be a rousing pirate adventure full of boarding parties and broadsides and battles with cutlasses and muskets. But sadly, it was not to be. Hyperion, as you may know, Disney bought CrossGen, and I had a couple of meetings with Hyperion, their publishing wing, about doing a sequel, because Hyperion did do a collection of the first 6 issues in trade paperback, and I talked to them about the sequel, and at our last meeting, they said, well, we've decided against it because we don't see where there's any more story. And I had never gotten to tell them the story I just told you. They just cut me off and said, no, there's nowhere else to go with this. And I think, honestly, their early interest was sincere, but I think someone in the higher ups at Disney said, why are we doing a pirate book that's not Pirates of the Caribbean? And so rather than tell me the truth, because editors are a fearful and cowardly lot generally, they made up a story that there was no story. Hamilton Blues lovers, what are your thoughts on Marvel's mid-'80s New Universe experiment? I thought it was a worthy experiment. I mean, trying to find new readers, trying to appeal to a new readership, but a lot of mistakes were made over the course. I think they shouldn't have introduced it with so many books at one time. I remember at the first convention I was at where they announced New Universe, there was a very palpable feeling of resentment from longtime comic fans. It's like, so the comics you've been producing are crap. Now we're supposed to do, we're supposed to accept this, and we're supposed to wholesale start buying these books too. In addition, I think the other problem with it is they just look like more Marvel books with characters you didn't recognize. There wasn't an effort to make these books look any different. This was all like Shooter's brainchild. But I think if Jim had taken an approach more like at Valiant, when Jim started at Valiant, those books look very different than Marvel comics. Very, very different. I mean, just from the covers and the opening pages, you're like, okay, this isn't a Marvel comic. This is a whole different look. It's kind of taking the Dell and Gold Key grid storytelling format and updating it. Very, very unlike a Marvel comic. And obviously that was the intention. Maybe Shooter learned from the New Universe experiment. Okay, I'm not going to make any of those mistakes again. And I think for the most part, these characters are kind of lackluster. I mean, Night Mask, seriously. I don't see how a lot of these titles were going to appeal to a new audience. They're just more costumed heroes. So people that like costume heroes would read about them. I think things like Kickers, we're going to make a sports-oriented character. I think that would have been better launched within the Marvel Universe, or maybe if they had taken this new universe and kind of put a book out here, put a book out there, and then eventually announced that these are all tied into a shared universe outside of Marvel. Sort of roll them out more slowly rather than pushing them out in one big bite. But generally, it was the same talents doing the Marvel books. And like I said, they just look like more Marvel, even down to the logos. It's just like they were like Marvel books from an alternate universe. Now, the one I had the most faith in was Merc, because it was going to be a reality-based adventure war book, but it was a contemporary war book about a mercenary, and mercenaries at the time New Universe was launched were kind of a hot thing. Everybody's talking about mercenaries. And the other thing that was encouraging was that Archie Goodwin had created it. I mean, he created this character. He created, I imagine he plotted the initial episodes. And but Peter David was hired to write it. And I can't imagine a story about a tough guy, mercenary guy, basically a soldier for hire. It's about as far from Peter David's wheelhouse as it is possible to imagine. And when you read the book, it was like, wow, this guy has no feel for this genre whatsoever. The artwork was good, but the story just wasn't there. It's like Peter I think he was, he was just starting out at Marvel, and I think he was just like, oh, I'll write anything. And even he had to know he was out of his depth, out of his league on something in this genre. So it was a big disappointment for me. But, you know, if it had been a great book, it still would have failed because the Universe line failed as a whole and was canned. Larry Lisk, how often do you go to conventions? What would it take to get you to come to one in the Seattle area? P.S. Washington State SummerCon is in 3 months. Hint, hint. Yeah. I just don't do a lot of cons. I don't do any cons anymore. I don't do shows. I don't do cons. I've been really busy. It's not health reasons or anything like that, but it's a lot of hassle. I love meeting the fans. I get to meet you here, right? I love meeting the fans and all that, but it takes a lot of time out of the schedule, and I'm super busy writing. And so, you know, my outreach is with my work rather than, you know, getting to meet me in person. So eventually I might get back to it. Now, what would it take me to get to Seattle? I think a team of kidnappers, maybe. There's a few places I have no desire to visit. And I'm sorry, Seattle, Portland, Oregon. I think the reasons are obvious and becoming more obvious every day. You know, Bangladesh, you know, it's just places I just have no desire to see. So sorry. And even if I do conventions and shows, I generally just do them within driving distance of my house in Florida. And Florida is a hotbed right now, well, of everything, but of comic shows and all the rest. So I could do a show every weekend if I wanted to, within driving distance of my house, within just an hour or so of my house. But I just don't feel the need right now. So not feeling it. COVID, blame COVID. Let's all blame COVID. COVID's a handy excuse for just about everything. So, hey, you get a twin spin. How about that? To get over your disappointment. While at DC on Robin and other titles in the Batverse, how hard was it to coordinate with the other writers for continuity in the Batverse? It wasn't that hard because we had leadership. As I mentioned earlier, the lack of leadership sort of leads to chaos and, more importantly, mediocrity. We had, and they're both pictured here, they're both in this group, we had Denny O'Neil and Archie Goodwin, at the wheel. And, they hired people who knew how to use a calendar and understood the characters and were team players. And we met at summits, much like this one. You can see a couple of the famous whiteboards in the background. This was 94. Oh, wow, 94. Anyway, so, it was easy when you had people running things who cared about quality, who made sure you were happy. I mean, Scott Peterson called me every Friday to say, is everything okay? Is there anything we need to do? Like I was some sort of fragile flower who wouldn't complain if I had a problem. But he would do that with all of his freelancers, and the other guys did too. Mostly because Denny was one of those mama birds who just kicked you out of the nest. You either flew or you didn't. He wasn't going to call and see how you felt about things unless your script didn't come in on time. It was a good crew, and we worked well together, and things like Nightfall, Contagion, Cataclysm, No Man's Land, all those things, they're all the result of that level of teamwork and that level of leadership. And once that level of leadership was gone, I mean, you can see for yourself the quality begins to suffer. Not to say that we all got along, like Dick and Jane, just wonderful, wonderful all the time. We had arguments, largely over things that had nothing to do with comics, but we were all professionals, and we all, worked together, put our egos aside for the greater good. Hey, triple spin. Larry, it's your lucky day. You have said you limit what you watch or read to avoid copying others' work. What genres do you avoid most? Well, I generally avoid fantasy anyway, because I'm not a big fantasy fan. I mean, I'm currently writing these Conan books. So I don't want other people's fantasy things in my head, but it's not easy for me to avoid fantasy because, like I said, it's not one of my favorite genres. I mean, I personally think, after Lord of the Rings, why did anybody bother? You either think you're going to do better than that, so fantasy by the pound and the recent spate of fantasy adaptations, I've avoided like the plague, both due to their quality, or lack of quality, and my lack of interest. So nothing interferes with me from that aspect. The one I do actively stay away from, because I write the Levon Cade novels, is vigilante justice things. I keep hearing that Reacher is wonderful and that I would really enjoy it, and I probably would, but I'm not going to watch it because it's too close. The genre is too close. Now, my understanding is Reacher is a little less based in reality. He's a little hipper, a little more arch and clever than Levon Cade ever tries to be. So, there isn't a lot of similarity between the two outside of the genre they share. But I don't want any of those ideas from Reacher in my head when I'm writing Levon Cade. So, eventually maybe I'll stop writing Levon Cade and I'll catch up with the Reacher series. But for right now, it's a no-no. Hey, I mentioned El Cazador. It's issue number 7. I do have the El Cazador issue number 7 script. Never drawn, never published, obviously. And if you'd like a copy, I will send it to you. It's the same deal I had for Denny O'Neill's Bat Bible and for the American Power Master File. If you contribute some money, it doesn't have to be a lot, to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which, if you don't know anything about St. Jude's, it is a hospital that helps children in the most dire circumstances you can imagine, health-wise. And the great thing about St. Jude's is the parents are never billed. People like you contribute to this hospital, and you literally save lives. You save lives, you change lives. And let me tell you, if you've ever known anybody that's had a sick child, you're saving families when you contribute to St. Jude's. So if you want a copy of El Cazador number 7, contribute to St. Jude's, and then let me know at brunobookstore@gmail.com. Say, hey, I threw a few bucks their way. I gave the kids, $5, $10, whatever. Let me know at brunobookstore@gmail.com, and then by return email, I will send you El Cazador script number 7. And if you've never gotten Denny O'Neill's Bat Bible, that deal still stands. I'll send you that if you want, and as well as the American Power Master File. So if any of those 3 things, which you're not going to get them anywhere else, this is one-stop shopping. Throw some money to St. Jude's for the kids, and I will more than happily send you some goodies. All right. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the awesome questions, pictures of the puppy, and I will see all